Chapter 2 Journey 1. There were two main routes carriages could take heading from Arantel toward the village of Carne to the northeast. They could go north and then follow the forest to the east, or they could start off going east and change course to head north. This time the group chose the former. Going along the forest made the monster encounter rate slightly higher, so it was technically the wrong choice for an escort job. But the reason they did it was the monster hunting work Ainz originally agreed to take on with Peter and his crew. There was the risk of chasing two hares and catching neither, but everyone felt sure in knowing that the powerful Momon and Nabe were there, so they chose that route. The lightning Ainz had Narbril cast once they were outside the city as proof she could use Tier 3 magic had surely helped put them at ease. In any case, they weren't going deep into the forest, just out to the plains, so they wouldn't run into any terribly powerful monsters. Since they would be more than able to deal with them, they decided it would be a good chance to verify each team's abilities in actual combat. They left Arantel when the sun was still a bit past its peak. Far in the distance they could see a virgin forest so dense it looked like a dark green lump. The thick trees stood straight up, and because their magnificent branches spread out and blocked the sun, visibility inside the forest was poor, and it almost felt as though one were being swallowed up by the darkness. The gaps between trees inspired terrible uneasiness. They seemed almost like gaping maws waiting for prey to jump in. The party was arranged with the cart in the center. The driver was inferior, naturally, and the others proceeded in a formation where Lecroute, the ranger, was out front, Peter the warrior was on the left flank, Druid Dine and Casterninha took the right, and Ainz and Narbril brought up the rear. They hadn't been terribly cautious, partly because visibility was good, but now, for the first time, Peter spoke in a slightly harder tone.
"Momon, we're entering a bit of a dangerous area. I don't think there will be any monsters we can't handle, but be on your guard just in case."
"Understood." As he nodded, Ainz suddenly thought of something. In a game, the monsters a player could encounter in a specific area were set, but there was no way that would hold in real life. God only knows what kind of tricky enemies we'll be up against. Ainz was confident in his own strength after the battle at Carne, and based on the info they were able to get out of the Sunlit Scripture members they'd caught. But that was confidence as a caster. At the present moment, Ainz could hardly cast any spells because he was wearing a suit of armor. With his speciality removed from the picture, would he be able to perform as the vanguard everyone was counting on him to be? Also, since this was an escort job, it wasn't simply a matter of defeating monsters. He had to add keeping Inferior alive to the victory conditions. Thinking about all that made him a little anxious. If push came to shove, he would ditch the armor and handle the situation with magic, but then he would either have to kill his party or use memory manipulation on them, so he didn't want that to happen. It'd be a pain. Ainz moved his head to look over at Narbril. She noticed him and nodded once. They'd planned so that she would cast spells higher than Tier 3, up to Tier 5, if it became necessary. Hopefully that would take care of things. If it didn't, then Ainz would take off his armor and get just a little bit serious. Lecroute seemed to have misunderstood something about the pair's eye contact, even though Ainz was still wearing his close helmet, and he called out to them in his jokey way. "We're fine. You don't need to worry so much. As long as we don't get ambushed, nothing bad'll happen. And as long as I'm our eyes and ears, that's no problemo. Right, Nabe? Aren't I amazing?" He pulled a gallant face, and Narbril laughed derisively. "May I have permission to beat that mosquito to a pulp, Mr. Momon?" "That's cold, but I'll take it." Everyone looked annoyed as he stuck his thumb up, but no one seemed to think anything of Nabe speaking so severely. Luckily, they seemed to have interpreted it as her looking down on Lecroute, not calling the entire human race lower life forms. Ainz dismissed her entreaty and felt like he had an ache in his non-existent stomach. "You're traveling with humans. be a tiny bit more discreet." Inferior must have understood his body language differently. He jumped in to say, "We're all right. Actually, from here to around Carne is the territory of the mighty magical beast known as the Wise King of the Forest. So it's very rare for other monsters to show up."
"The Wise King of the Forest?"
Ainz recalled what he'd found out in Carne. The Wise King of the Forest was supposedly a magical beast who possessed a terrible amount of power and could even cast spells. He lived so deep in the forest that there were next to no eyewitness accounts, but tales of his existence had been passed down since long, long ago. One account said he was a silver, four-legged beast with the tail of a snake who had lived for hundreds of years. I'd like to meet this guy. That story's hard to swallow, but if he's really that old, he might have a crazy amount of wisdom. I mean, he's called the Wise King of the Forest. Capturing him should help strengthen Nazarik's position. Ainz vaguely remembered what the magical beast looked like. The Wise King of the Forest. I'm pretty sure there was an extinct animal called something like that. It looked kind of like a monkey. Oh, right, an orangutan. A person, or a wise man, who lived in the woods with a tail like a snake. I think there was a monster like that. Ainz thought there had been something like that in Yggdrasil, and then he realized what it was. A chimera! Pretty sure that had the face of a monkey, the body of a badger, the limbs of a tiger, and the tail of a snake. I don't know for sure if this will be the Yggdrasil monster, but if this is anything like those angel summons, there's a good chance. As Ainz was recalling everything he knew about Yggdrasil's chimera, Lecruit was casually talking to Narbrol again. Okay. I gotta do a flawless job so that lovely Nabe will like me more." Narbrol's response was a click of her tongue that seemed to contain all the hatred from the bottom of her heart. Lecruit appeared shocked, but no one moved to console him. It seemed they had started considering the pair's back and forth a comedy act. Chatting like that now and then, the party continued on, the scorching sun at their backs. As they tramped through the grass, some of the juices from the crushed plants stuck to their leather boots, giving off a green smell. Watching everyone mop their sweat, Ainz was thankful for his undead body, which had no trouble at all with the sun beating down and didn't tire out even though he was wearing heavy armor. Lecruit continued to be the one to break the silence with his perky remarks. "You guys don't have to be on the lookout so much. I got my eyes open. I mean, check out Nabe. She's totally relaxed because she believes in me." "Not you. It's because of Mr. Momon." Creases appeared in her brow, sensing that in another second or two she'd explode and do something outrageous. Ainz laid a hand on her shoulder, and her expression softened immediately. Seeing that, Lecruit had a question for them. "Hey, are you sure you two aren't actually lovers?" "Lovers? What are you talking about? He has Mr. Salbedo!"
"You!" Ainz blurted. "Watch your mouth, Nabe!"
"Ah!" Narbrol's eyes popped wide open, and she slapped her hands over her mouth. Ainz cleared his throat and spoke in a cold voice.
"Lecruit, could I ask you to please not inquire any further?"
"Oh, sorry about that. I was just joking. So you're with someone already, huh?" Lecruit didn't seem very sorry as he bobbed his head, but Ainz wasn't so mad at him. This time, Narbrol had been too careless. He wondered if he'd brought the wrong person, but he was going nuts in his head because there wasn't anyone else for him to mobilize. In Ainzul Gone, all the members were grotesques, and almost all the NPCs they'd created were also grotesques. So there was almost no one who could infiltrate a human city. Narbrol was one of the few who had a human appearance, even though it was fake. But Ainz hadn't taken her personality into consideration when he'd picked her. Looking back, Lupus Regina Beta, also a member of the Pleiades, might have been more suitable, but it was too late now. Narbril was looking pale in the face following her error, so Ainz patted her back a few times to make her feel better. A great boss forgave his subordinates their first mistake. He would just let her have it if it happened again. Having her get all depressed and listless about it could impinge on her performance going forward, and that would only make things worse. And after all, she had only said Albedo's name. It probably wasn't even necessary to manipulate anyone's memories.
Recruit, cut the chatter and focus on keeping watch.
Yes, sir.
Momon, I apologize for my friend's behavior. He knows he shouldn't be asking personal questions. It's okay. As long as it doesn't happen again, I'm fine overlooking it this time.
Both of them looked simultaneously at Lecrute's back, only to be discouraged by hearing him say, "Oh, now Nabe hates me. Her affection for me is negative."
That idiot. I'll give him a good talking to later, and we'll pretend we never heard that earlier detail. Ah, well, okay. Thanks. And then if Lecrute's on watch, I'd like to leave it to him and take the opportunity to talk a bit. Sure, go ahead. We'll make him work to offset the trouble he caused.
Peter smiled, and Ainz moved to walk alongside Ninya and Dine. In exchange, Dine dropped back to line up with Narbril.
I'd like to ask you a few things about magic.
Ninya said that was fine, so Ainz asked a question. Inferia looked on, seeming to have taken an interest in their conversation.
People being manipulated with charm or dominate spells end up giving all the intelligence they have. But is there a spell that, as a counter to that, would cause someone to die if they were asked the same question multiple times under certain circumstances?
I've never heard of a spell like that.
Ainz moved his head to look at Inferia through his helmet.
Me neither. You might be able to do a delayed cast using magic modification buffs.
I see.
That wasn't the answer he'd been hoping for. He was no closer to solving the issue of how to use the remaining Sunlit Scripture prisoners. There weren't very many survivors left, and using them for nothing would be a pity. In order to see if they had some magical medical device that could make them disappear when they died, Ainz had had a few of them dissected live, but it had been a pretty big waste. If things were going to end up like that, then he should have tried to get info out of them once he realized they would die. He missed 3 chances per captive to get information out of them. But Nigun was the biggest waste. Using him first had been a mistake. He was the man with the most intelligence among them, and he'd been finished off on such a simple question. Well, it hadn't all been for nothing. That failure led to the understanding that he wouldn't be able to deal with everything in this world using the knowledge he'd cultivated in Yggdrasil. It was better to consider things optimistically. He had learned a lot. While Ainz was thinking absent-mindedly on those things, Ninya continued his answer.
Still, I only know a fraction of all the spells that exist. In countries that cultivate casters on a national level, it's possible they've created that sort of spell. In the Slain Theocracy, for instance, they train priests, casters who use faith magic. And in the Baharuth Empire, they have an academy for arcaners, sorcerers, wizards, and other arcane magic classes. I wouldn't be surprised if the Argland Council State had some kind of magic using the dragon's wisdom.
I see. So you wouldn't be surprised if it existed.
The Argland Council State, according to the information he'd gathered so far, was a subhuman nation governed by a group of counselors. Given the Slain Theocracy's principle of human superiority, the 2 nations were a conflict waiting to happen. The Council State was especially known for its 5 dragon counselors, who were said to possess great power. Ainz was interested in that country, but since he was still not all the way on his feet, he couldn't quite get there at the moment, especially given the sharp drop in Nazarik's war potential.
Okay then, there's something else I'd like to ask.
Asking Ninya his other questions, Ainz felt very satisfied. The other members of the Swords of Darkness only looked at him to note that Ainz was at it again. He'd gotten Ninya, Peter, and the others to tell him so much that it had become a routine. He learned about a myriad of topics, such as magic, martial arts, adventurers, nearby countries, and so on. He had to be careful about what he asked, but everything he heard was extremely useful, and he was confident that his knowledge about the world had increased a great deal. But it still wasn't enough. Every time he learned something, the things he needed to know multiplied. That was especially the case with magic. He was surprised by how different things were in a world based on magic. One thing that was especially affected was the level of civilization. It appeared to be something like the Middle Ages, when in fact it was probably closer to pre-modern, or in some cases nearly modern. Supporting this level of technology was magic. Once Ainz realized that, he gave up thinking too hard about the progress of technology. For someone who had lived in a world with scientific technology, it was possible to think too deeply about this world with its entirely different system. They even had magic to produce spices like salt and sugar, as well as magic to return nutritive value to the soil to avoid damaging it by replanting the same crops over and over. On top of that, he wasn't sure if it was true or false. But he'd heard that the ocean wasn't salty. That was how far this world departed from Ainz's common sense. How long had he been cautiously satisfying his curiosity when... Something moved. Lecruit announced abruptly with palpable tension in his voice. None of the silliness from the tone he had used when talking to Narbril was present. This was the voice of an experienced pro-adventurer. Everyone immediately readied their weapons in the direction Lecruit was looking. "Where is it?" "There. Right there." Lecruit pointed in response to Peter's question to a part of the giant forest. Since it was shaded by trees, it was difficult to see inside, and there was no sign of anything there. Even so, no one doubted him. "It'd be pushing it to just rush in there, so unless it comes out of the woods, let's ignore it." "Well, it's probably smart to follow our plan and have Inferior move back." While they were talking, the forest stirred and the monsters slowly came into view. There were 15 small creatures about as tall as children. Surrounding them were 6 large ones. The smaller ones were subhumans called goblins. They had flattened noses and 2 little fangs stuck up out of their mouths, which seemed almost like big rips in their squashed faces. Their skin was light brown. Their messy, oily clumps of grimy hair were black. It was hard to tell if their raggedy dark brown clothing was dyed or just dirty. Over it they wore animal hides in place of armor. Each carried a wooden club in one hand and a small shield in the other. They were like a cross between a human and a monkey, with a handful of viciousness on top. Each of the fewer, larger monsters stood between around 7.5 to almost 10 feet tall. With their jaws jutting way forward, their faces were imbecility incarnate. Their arms bulging with muscles brought to mind large trees, and their hands nearly reached the ground, although their stooped backs helped. They carried clubs that looked like they had ripped them straight off a tree and wore untanned animal skins around their waists. Their horrid stench seemed to waft all the way to where the adventurers were. Their warty skin was darkish brown, and their pecs and abs were built. From the look of them, they seemed quite strong, and the overall impression they made was of big, hairless chimpanzees with a warped twist. These monsters were of the subhuman race known as ogres. Almost all of them were carrying bags that looked to be made of rags. They must have been migrating some distance. The monsters looked over the party of adventurers and then began stepping out onto the grass. They were still some distance away, but the hostile looks on their ugly faces could be read easily enough. "There are quite a lot of them, huh? We're not going to be able to avoid a fight at this rate." "Yeah, goblins and ogres tend to go on the attack when they see they outnumber their opponents. Or rather, they're too stupid to evaluate their opponent's strength on anything besides numbers. What a pain." Ainz understood his situation, and things had definitely sunk in, but he still cocked his head slightly at how different from a game it felt. The goblins and ogres all had individualized features, whether it be their height or the darkness of their skin. In other words, they weren't all identical. That made him feel like he was facing 21 unfamiliar monsters.
Reality is no game,
he lamented in a voice the others couldn't hear. He was seized by the feeling he used to get when hurtling into a new area without reading a strategy guide and clashing with monsters he'd never heard of. It reminded him of the things he'd realized during the Battle of Carne.
"So, Maumon." "Oh, what is it?"
"We said we'd have you take half of them, so how would you like to divide them up?"
"We can't just split into our 2 teams and kill them as they come."
"That'll get complicated if they all bunch up on one team. Nabe, is it possible for you to take out all the goblins at once with an area of effect spell like Fireball?"
"I can't use Fireball. The spell I have with the most firepower is probably Lightning."
"So it's that kind of setup," Ainz murmured in his head. "Lightning pierces in a straight line, right?" "In that case, if we manage to get them all lined up, could you shoot through them from the side?"
"We'd have to have someone preventing them from charging."
"Oh, I'll take care of that. But most importantly, Inferior's in the cart. Can anyone else protect him?"
"Momon?"
"I'd be all talk if I had trouble with a couple ogres. I'll show you how easy it is to butcher these guys."
The Swords of Darkness members understood what Ainz, in a voice brimming with confidence, was saying, and were relieved that they felt they could trust him. "Got it. That said, we shouldn't be allowing the enemy to charge either. We'll back you up as much as we can."
Do you need any support magic?"
"Oh, we're fine. You should support your teammates."
"Okay, I'll do that. Everyone, if we engage here, we're close to the forest, so there's a chance they'll run away."
"Then let's do what we always do. We'll draw them out like yanking a turtle's head out of its shell."
"Oh, that's a fine plan. So Momon is blocking the charge, but how should we deal with the ones who get by, Peter?"
"I'll trap the ogres with the martial art fortress. Dine, you deal with any goblins that slip through. Ninya, cast defensive magic on me. After that, although it might not be necessary, pay attention to how Nabe is faring while you focus on using attack magic. Recruit, pick off any goblins you can. If any ogres get by, get in their way. In that case, Ninya, prioritize cleaning up the goblins." Everyone took Peter's orders simply by exchanging firm nods. The battle plan was coming together quite smoothly. They were really on the same wavelength. Impressed, Ainz couldn't help but sigh. He remembered his days in Yggdrasil. He and his guildmates had also been on the same wavelength when they went out grinding together. Decoy, pull, block, select targets. The kind of team play that can only be done when all the members know one another's abilities inside out. Maybe Ainz was biased, but he didn't think chemistry like that was so easy to create. That said, he caught a glimpse of it in the Swords of Darkness, even if they weren't as in sync as his old friends. "Momon, do you need any backup from us besides magic?"
"No, that won't be necessary. We're fine as the 2 of us."
"You're really confident, huh?" Ainz could sense some worry in Peter's tone. "Are you really going to be all right?" But if the block were easily broken, they were in danger of being wiped out one by one. He was uneasy about that. They weren't playing a game. Lives would be taken.
"You'll understand once we get started."
With that as his only response, Ainz cut the conversation short.
"If your team's ready to go, we can start the fight."
Lecruit drew his composite longbow. The creaking of the bowstring stopped, and then came the bing of it slicing through the air. The loosed arrow flew straight across the grass and landed about 10 yards from the goblins, who were on the move. They had put up their shields and were slowly closing the distance, but in response to Lecruit's sudden attack, they jeered. They were laughing at him because he missed. Of course, they couldn't hit a target more than 140 yards away either. But they had conveniently forgotten that. Then, the fact that they had been attacked and the overwhelming imbalance in their respective numbers incited their inherent violence, so they all screamed and ran at full speed, unthinking, toward Lecruit. The ogres also charged after a short delay. Having lost themselves in their thirst for blood, they had no formation and didn't even take the defensive measure of keeping their shields up. There was nothing left inside their heads. Noticing as much, Lecruit cracked a smile. Heh. The distance separating them was about 100 yards when he took his next shot. This one didn't miss, but went through a goblin's head. It was the one farthest to the rear. It tottered a few more steps before crumpling to the ground, dead. The distance was closing before Lecruit's eyes, but his hand knocking the next arrow showed no sign of nervousness. Even if they got right on top of him, he knew he had a friend nearby who would protect him. "Reinforce armor!" With the sound of Ninya casting a defensive spell behind him, Lecruit loosed another arrow. Another shot at 60 yards, another pierced head, another goblin tumbling to the ground. Then Peter and Dine started to move. The goblins were nimble, but the ogres took larger steps, so there wasn't much of a pace gap between the two groups. That said, they were running over about 110 yards of grass, so the ogres with their more powerful legs were out front and the goblins followed. Each group was spread out to some extent, making it difficult to capture very many of them in an area of effect spell. But that was fine. Dine's first job was to trap an ogre. "Twine plant!" When he cast the spell, the grass under one ogre's feet began to flail like a whip and twist around them. Restrained by plants tough as chains, the ogre began to get frustrated, and its roar resounded across the plain. Into this scene at a leisurely pace walked Ainz, followed by Narberl. No one, looking at his gait, would imagine he was headed into a fight against charging monsters. It looked more like he was taking a stroll through the meadow than navigating a combat zone. As the nearest ogre was getting closer, Ainz crossed his hands over opposite shoulders to clutch the hilts of his swords. Narberl put her hands under his cape to pull the sheaths off. Then the blades slowly appeared in two great, huge arcs. Every one of the swords of darkness gasped at the dazzling spectacle. The nearly 5-foot swords Ainz gripped were so splendid they seemed like they might have more value as works of art than as weapons. The keen blades coldly gleamed, their tips spreading into fan shapes and their grooves engraved with a pattern resembling two intertwining snakes. They were weapons a hero would wield, and Ainz had one in each hand. Seeing him like that caused all the swords of darkness to gasp again. If the previous gasp had been in admiration, this time they were knocked completely speechless. Swords get heavier the longer they are. It was only natural. No matter what kind of spell was cast to lighten the load, swinging these around would have been no easy feat. After traveling with Ainz for a short time, they understood he was exceptionally strong, but the common sense they'd amassed up till then didn't allow for the sight of him holding a greatsword in each hand so comfortably. But he swung them around into a fighting stance so easily they might have been twigs. He cut quite a majestic figure. "Momon, you're incredible!" Peter gasped, representative of everyone's shock. As a warrior himself, he'd just been instantly taught what kind of strength was possible, and it dawned on him how long he would have to train to achieve it. He'd had the vague notion that he and Ainz were on different levels, but having conclusive proof before his eyes gave him shivers that started in his toes. Even goblins with their lesser intelligence seemed to realize they should be afraid. Their recklessly charging feet slowed, and they changed course to take a longer way around to Peter and the others. Only the ogres continued to barrel toward Ainz, too dim-witted to second-guess their strength. As the distance closed, they raised their weapons. No matter how long Ainz's swords were, the ogres were still huge and had better range with their equally huge clubs. It looked like the ogres would get the first attack, but then Ainz rushed at them. He was like a hurricane. Then, in an even faster flash of silver, the sword in his right hand flew through the air as if he were cutting space itself. The attack was too magnificent. Regardless of the fact that they hadn't even been cut, everyone watching felt the sudden presence of death right beside them, so much so that every hair on their bodies stood on end. It was over in that single swing. Ainz targeted a new ogre, leaving the one in front of him. As if waiting for him to move away, the upper body of the now stock-still first ogre slipped to the ground, leaving the lower body standing. The spray of blood, slop of innards, and diffusion of an awful stench throughout the area were the signs that this was neither a dream nor an illusion. He'd cut the monster in two with a single diagonal stroke. Although they were in the middle of a battle, both friends and foes froze to observe the riveting scene as if time had stopped. A deadly blow, and one that would slice a monster as meaty as an ogre in half. A "whoa!" escaped someone's lips. The battlefield had fallen so silent that everyone heard it.
I can't believe it. He must be a mithroplate, or maybe orichalcum. No! Could he be adamantite?
To cut an opponent in two, it wasn't an impossible move per se. Someone who trained up a very targeted set of skills, or who had a powerful magical weapon, could probably pull it off. But to hold a gigantic, two-handed greatsword in one hand and give it enough momentum to cut someone in half would be difficult. That was common sense. A two-handed sword was used with two hands and relied on mass and centrifugal force to cut. They weren't about slicing and dicing with physical strength. So the only way to explain what Ainz had just done was to conclude that his sword was endowed with incomparable magic, that he had more strength in one arm than most warriors had in two, or both. The ogres that had stopped in their tracks, shocked by the scene in front of them, began to backpedal with fear written on their faces. Ainz advanced one step to fill in the distance.
What's the matter? Not going to attack?
His quiet, casual voice floated over the battlefield. Even just that question scared the ogres, because they'd just seen how overwhelming the gap in strength was between Ainz and them. Ainz moved in on an ogre so quickly it was hard to believe he was wearing full-plate armor.
Oh!
The ogre raised a hoarse voice in what could have been either a shriek or a battle cry as it readied its club against Ainz. But anyone would have recognized it was moving too slowly. As Ainz closed in, the sword in his left hand moved as if he were going to lightly brush the ogre away. Its upper body went tumbling through the air to land somewhere completely different from its lower body. He'd just cut the monster in two with a single horizontal slice.
Mammon, are you a monster?
Witnessing another riveting scene, nobody had any objections to what Diana had said.
Okay, and as for the rest...
Ainz stepped forward, and the other ogres, ugly faces frozen in fear, moved farther back. The goblins that had taken a large detour to the side got around and attacked Peter and the others. The Swords of Darkness had lost themselves in amazement, but now had to spring into action. Peter readied his broadsword and large shield, and ran to meet the 14+ goblins. The head of the one out in front went spinning off after a lunging swipe. Dodging the fountain of blood, Peter closed in on the rest of the goblins.
Eat less!
A goblin bared its yellowed teeth as its foul, throaty scream filled the air. Peter easily took a goblin club strike with his shield. The hit that came from the side got blocked and repelled with a loud crack thanks to the magic reinforcing his armor.
Magic arrow!
2 glowing shots of magic nailed the goblin trying to hit Peter from behind, and it collapsed like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Half of the goblins surrounding Peter ran at the remaining 3 Swords of Darkness. None of them went to attack Narbril, who was standing next to the gale force wind of death named Ainz. Lacroute had tossed aside his composite longbow and whipped out a short sword. Both he and the mace-wielding Dine dashed into Ninya's line of fire to provide cover for him. The fight between Lacroute and Dine and 5 goblins was about evenly matched. If they paced themselves, they could probably beat them off one by one, but it would take a while. Lacroute had taken a club to one arm and was tolerating the pain with an obvious grimace as he stabbed his short sword into a gap in a goblin's leather armor. Dine had taken a bit of a beating, and although his movements had become somewhat sluggish, it didn't seem like any of his wounds were too critical. Ninya, keeping a sharp eye on the situation, began to conserve magic. There was one ogre immobilized with a spell. If circumstances called for it, he would have to take it on. Meanwhile, Peter was spending equal time on offense and defense against 6 goblins. The 11 goblins' violence didn't overwhelm the adventurers, though, because there was hesitation in their attacks. Their morale had dropped significantly after witnessing Ainz's amazing one-hit kills, and they hadn't made up their minds yet if they should fight or flee. Then, as if to crush their morale further, one of Ainz's swords swung in a huge arc. No one could hear anything but the sound of it slicing through the air, and then something heavy falling to the ground. 2 things, in fact. As everyone expected, the number of ogre corpses had increased. Now the only ogres remaining were the one trapped in the grass, and the one cowering before Ainz. Perhaps because it had felt the gaze of Ainz's eyes from deep within the thin slit of his helmet, it emitted a bizarre groan and attempted to escape, dropping its club and racing back toward the forest faster than it had run over. But there was no way it would be allowed to get away. "Nabe, get him." His icy voice rang out, and Narbril, who had been standing behind him, gave a quick nod. "Lightning!" A bolt of lightning sent large vibrations through the air and shot through the fleeing ogre's body with a peal of thunder. Then it continued on through the ogre that was still tangled up behind him. That was all it took to stop the beating pulses of 2 ogres. "Let's get out of here!" "Run away! Run away!" The goblins that had been watching these events unfold as if in a trance called for a retreat and went to flee, but as might be expected, Peter and his crew moved faster. The demoralized goblins were not so tough anymore. They were taken care of one after another in smooth succession. Ninya figured he didn't need to conserve magic any longer, and added his powers to the fray. The goblins were killed in the blink of an eye. Amid the reek of the dead bodies, Dine tended to Lacroute's and Peter's wounds with light healing, while Ninya, with nothing to do, went around slicing the ears off the goblins with a dagger. By turning items like those into the guilds, they would be compensated per monster. Of course, it wasn't always ears. A specific part was required from each kind of monster. That said, for subhumans like goblins and ogres, it was usually ears. As he was removing the ears with a practiced hand, he saw that Ainz, accompanied by Narbril, seemed to be searching the vicinity where the ogres had fallen.
"Are you looking for something?"
Ainz looked up to respond to Ninya's question.
"Yeah, just seeing if there are any drops, especially crystals."
"Crystals? I've never heard of ogres carrying precious stones."
"So they don't, huh? I was just thinking maybe on the off chance."
"Oh yeah, it would be great if ogres carried treasure around," said Ninya, adeptly clipping off ogre ears. "But wow, Momon, I knew you had confidence in your abilities, but I didn't realize how strong you really were."
In response to Ninya's comments, the other 3 who were almost finished healing chimed in with more praise for Ainz.
"You are amazing! As a warrior, I hope I can be as awesome as you someday. How did you get so strong?"
"With Nabe along and all, I figured you were rich, but where are those fantastic swords from? I don't think I've ever seen more expensive-looking swords."
"Now I see what you were saying at the guild was for real. You might be as strong as the oft-rumored about strongest warrior in the kingdom. I'm impressed."
Nabe looked smug enough to snigger next to Ainz, but he demurred. Nah, it just happened to work out.
Just happened to work out? Peter smiled wryly. Really? The way you fought reminded me there's always someone stronger.
I know you guys will get to the point where you can take care of small fries like that easily, too.
Everyone's smiles got wryer. Peter and his friends were working hard at getting stronger, and they didn't waste a copper of their rewards, only spending on things that would make them stronger. That's why they'd been able to work so well together so far. But even reflecting on how far they'd come, they didn't imagine they'd ever be able to reach Ainz's level. To the Swords of Darkness, Ainz's level was the furthest of extremes, which only a handful of people were allowed to access. This guy they were traveling with would probably go on to be a hero whose name would be known by all. He was one of the greats who could stand at the pinnacle of adventuring. That was all they could think.